I said that to enter the cafe in the cul-de-sac Lefebvre was to enter the sanction of a man of genius. But then it was only the man of genius who could duly estimate the merits of the sanctum. A sign consisting of a vast folio swung before the entrance. On one side of the volume was painted a bottle, on the other reverse, a pate. On the back side were visible in large letters, Ouvre de Bonbon. Thus was delicately shadowed forth the twofold occupation of the proprietor. Upon stepping upon the threshold, the whole interior of the building presented itself to view. A low, a long, low-pitched room of antique construction was indeed all the accommodation afforded by the cafe. In a corner of the apartment stood the bed of the metaphysician. An array of curtains, together with a canopy of a la Greek, gave it the air at once classic and comfortable. In the corner diagonally opposite appeared in direct family communion the properties of the kitchen and the bibliothèque. A dish of polemics stood peacefully upon the dresser. Here lay an oven full of the latest ethics. There a kettle of duodecimo Malongis. Volumes of German morality were hand in glove with the gridiron. A toasting fork might be discovered by the side of Eusebius. Plato reclined at his ease in the frying pan, and contemporary manuscripts were filed away upon the spit. In other respects, the Café de Bonbon might be said to differ little from the usual restaurants of the period. A large fireplace yawned opposite the door. On the right of the fireplace, an open cupboard displayed a formidable array of labeled bottles. It was here, about 12 o'clock at night, during the severe winter, that Pierre Bonbon, after having listened to for some time in the comments of his neighbors upon a singular propensity, that Pierre Bonbon, I say, having turned them all out of his house, locked the door upon them with an oath, and betook himself in no pacific mood to the comforts of a leather bottom armchair and a fire of blazing faggots. It was on one of those terrific nights which are only met with once or twice during a century. It snowed fiercely, and the house tottered to its center with the floods of wind that, rushing through the crannies of the wall and pouring impetuously down the chimney, shook awfully the curtains of the philosopher's bed, and disorganized the economy of his pate pans and papers. The huge folio sign that swung without, exposed to the fury of the tempest, creaked ominously and gave out a moaning sound from its stanchions of a solid oak. It was in no placid temper, I say, that the metaphysician drew up his chair to his customary station by the hearth. Many circumstances of a perplexing nature had occurred during this day to disturb the serenity of the meditations. In attempting du oeuf à la princesse, he had unfortunately perpetuated omelette à la rune, à la reine. The discovery of a principle in ethics had been frustrated by the overturning of a stew, and last but not least, he had thwarted in one of those admirable bargains which he had at all times took such especial delight in bringing to a successful termination. But in the chafing of his mind at these unaccountable vicissitudes, there had not failed to mingle some degree of that nervous anxiety with which the fury of a boisterous night is so well calculated to produce. Whistling to his more immediate vicinity the large black water dog we have spoken of before, and settling himself uneasily in his chair, he could not help casting a weary and unquiet eye toward those distant recesses of the apartment whose inexorable shadows not even the red firelight itself could more than partially succeed in overcoming. Having completed a scrutiny whose exact purpose was perhaps unintelligible to himself, he drew close to his seat a small table covered with books and papers, and soon became absorbed in the task of retouching a voluminous manuscript intended for publications in the morrow. He had been thus occupied for some minutes when "I am in no hurry, Monsieur Bonbon," suddenly whispered a whining voice in the apartment. "The devil!" ejaculated our hero, starting to his feet, overturning the table at his side, and staring around himself in astonishment. "Very true," calmly replied the voice. "Very true? What is very true? How came you here?" vociferated the metaphysician, as his eye fell upon something which lay stretched in full length upon its bed. "I was saying," said the intruder, without attending in the in interrogatories, "I was saying that I am not at all pushed for a time, that the business upon which I took the liberty of calling is of no pressing importance. In short, that I can very well wait until you have finished your exposition." "My exposition there now! How do you know? How came you to understand that I was writing an exposition? Good God!" "Hush!" replied the figure, in a shrill undertone, and rising quickly from the bed, he made a single step toward our hero, while an iron lamp that suspended overhead swung convulsively back from his approach. The philosopher's amazement did not present a narrow scrutiny of the stranger's dress and appearance. The outlines of his figure, exceedingly lean, but much upon the common height, were rendered minutely distinct by means of a faded suit of black cloth, which fitted high to the skin, but was otherwise cut very much in the style of a century ago. These garments had evidently been intended for a much shorter person than our present owner. His ankles and wrists were left naked for several inches, and his shoes, however, a pair of very brilliant buckles, gave the lie to the extreme poverty implied by the other proportions of his dress. His head was bare and entirely bald, with the exception of the hinder part, from which depended a queue of considerable length. pair of green spectacles with side glasses protected his eyes from the influence of the light, and at the same time prevented our hero from ascertaining either their color or their conformation. About the entire person there was no evidence of a color of a shirt, but a white cravat of filthy appearance was tied with extreme precision around the throat, and the ends hanging down formally side by side gave, although I dare say unintentionally, the idea of an ecclesiastic. Indeed, many other points, both in his appearance and demeanor, might have been very well sustained at conception of that nature. Over his left ear he carried, after the fashion of a modern clerk, an instrument resembling the stylus of the ancients. In a breast pocket of his cloak appeared conspicuously a small black volume fastened with clasps of steel. This book, whether accidentally or not, was so turned out outwardly to the person as to discover the words Rituel Catholique in white letters upon the back. His entire physiognomy was interestingly saturnine, even cadaverously pale. The forehead was lofty and deeply furrowed with the ridges of contemplation. The corners of the mouth were drawn down in the expression of the most submissively humility. There was also a clasping of the hands as he stepped toward our hero, a deep sigh, and altogether a look of utter sanctity, as could not have failed to be unequivocally prepossessing. Every shadow of anger faded from the countenance of his metaphysician, as having completed a satisfactory survey of his visitor's person, he shook cordially by the hand and conducted him to a seat. There would, however, be a radical error in attributing this instantaneous transition of feeling in the philosopher to any one of those causes which might naturally be supposed to have had an influence. Indeed, Pierre Bonbon, from what I have been able to understand of his disposition, was of all men the least likely to be imposed upon by any speciousness of exterior deportment. It was impossible to so accurate an observer of men and things should have failed to discover upon the moment the real character of the personage who had intruded upon his hospitality. To say no more, the conformation of his visitor's feet was sufficiently remarkable. He maintained lightly upon his head an inordinately tall hat, and there was a tremendous swelling about the hinder part of his breeches, and the vibration of his coat tail was a palpable fact. Judge then with what feelings of satisfaction our hero found himself thrown thus at once in the society of a person from whom he had at all times entertained the most unqualified respect. He was, however, too much diplomatist to let escape him any intimation of his suspicions in regard to the true state of affairs. It was not his cue to appear at all conscious of the high honor he thus unexpectedly enjoyed, but with leading his guest into conversation to elicit some important ethical ideas which might, in obtaining the place his contemplated publication, enlighten the human race, and at the same time immortalize himself. Ideas which I should have added his visitor's great age and well-known proficiency. in the science of morals might very well have enabled him to afford.